guys, it's been a long time coming, but I'm proud to announce that my hands are finally registered with the International Registry of Lethal Hands. This is the only place where your God-given gifts of danger can get the recognition that they truly deserve. Now you might be thinking, why on earth would anybody need to register their hands as lethal? Let me break it down for you. There are those among us whose hands are so downright dangerous, they need to be documented. Registration is a moral responsibility, and it's a vote for the greater good of humanity. The sole mission of the International Registry for Lethal Hands is to catalog the most formidable hands on the planet. So if you know someone, and you even suspect they possess lethal hands, do not hesitate. Register them immediately. And if you've ever looked at your own hands and thought, damn, these dogs are dangerous, don't settle. Go register. Head over to registeryourhands.com, fill out a simple form, and you're official. Remember, use the promo code Chael to save 20%, or just click on the link below. I get home yesterday. My super beautiful wife, Brittany, says to me, hey, I thought you and Jon Fitch were friends. And I said, yeah, we are. What's up? I thought maybe he was in trouble or something like this. So what's up? She goes, well, he just did an interview and he had some pretty rough things to say about you. So I think that can't be right. That can't be right. So I go and I bring it up. And it was on a YouTube. And it had been seen, I think, by 14 people. It was a very low number count, but my wife was one of them. So I click on it, and Fitch was one of the protagonists. I believe the original. If any part of what I tell you is off, it's 100% what I think. I think Chung Lee, Jon Fitch, Nate Quarry were the three that brought the class action lawsuit. That's how I remember it. But a couple of lawsuits came up along the way, or at least threats of them, but this is how I remember it. And for a class action lawsuit, you must have three or more. So if you're an attorney or you're a legal firm, and you think you've got something that you're willing to take a case on pro bono, in exchange, I apologize, not pro bono, contingency, no money up front, but if you want to go class action, which is where the big dollar signs are, you've got to have three. And those were the three. So this got resolved. This class action got resolved. And I never liked it. If you were to ask me, I never liked it because I never saw anything that I would deem to be bad business. I mean, just for example, and understanding the history of the sport is so wildly important if you're going to come to a philosophy and or an opinion. So, like one of Fitch's big things against me is that I was on the other side. I was on the side of the UFC, which was, hey, we haven't done anything wrong. And he referred to me as a bootlicker because of this. And one of my pushbacks, again, understanding the history of the sport, understanding why the government got involved, why commissions got involved. There is no sport outside of communist regimes that is overseen by government. Are you aware of that? If you look at the Olympic Games that are coming up, there is no sport that is overseen by the government except in communist countries, with one exception, and that is combat, and that is here in the United States. But there's very good reason that we had to go to that level and bring the government in. So when I'm looking at was anything done wrong, I'm looking at the real obvious stuff that you guys would think of. Were you paid what you were expecting to be paid? And equally as important, was that payment given to you in the time manner of which was priorly agreed? I mean, that's it, right? The date is Maybe the most important part of the contract. And you would understand that if I told you guys I'm going to give you $1 billion, you go, whoa, Chael's a man of his word. I can't believe it. I got $1 billion coming. And then I explained to you, I'm going to give you $1 a year for the next billion years. I'll say, oh, okay, it's one of those things. So I only share that because there was nowhere within the complaint that anybody was forced to do anything. There's nobody where within the complaint that once agreed upon, it was not followed through, or there was an attempted renegotiation, or there was somebody that had to threaten legal action. It was nothing like, right, just to get your money. And that's very common in a lot of industries, including this one where the funds never came, which is why the government got involved. Now, I don't want to digress too far down that road, but for me to come to the conclusion that the UFC has done nothing wrong, that a market value is paid, I don't believe that lawsuit was ever to do with we weren't paid enough. I've listened to all of the arguments, but when it's done, and I think of myself as a very reasonable person, when the arguments were done, and no matter who laid them out, whether it was a bystander that felt that way, whether it was one of the three names that I just named, I mean, Nate Quarry and I couldn't be any closer. Could not be any closer with Nate. I'd call him right now and say, hey man, I need a pint of blood, and he would come down, right? But I'm just sharing with you, including when Nate would lay it out, I never heard an argument where I didn't come to the same conclusion, which is this isn't, from a sincere standpoint, about I wasn't paid enough. You made too much. That is where the resentment came. And that was even stated time and time again. Hey, there's other promotions out here. Hey, their contracts are a little tighter and a little tougher than these. They're more of the old school boxing contract where once you sign, you can never get out. So if the UFC is in the spotlight, of course these other ones are going to be, hey, market value and what guys can be expected to be paid before incentives and before bonuses is pretty level across the field everywhere. Even back in the Pride days, numbers were a little harder to get over there. A lot of things were done in cash, but I will share with you as an insider that would know. So if the UFC is in jeopardy, that's my point. If the UFC was doing something that needs review, of course the others would too, but they weren't. Not only was there not a review, not only was there not a class action, was there not a legal team that was willing to take this on in a contingency, there wasn't even bad-mouthing done in the media. It was not a conversation at all. But they had similar start and stop dates. Ancillary rights has been a really big one. And yes, I'm a word that I don't say ancillary correctly. Pay was very similar. The UFC's was a much more beautiful contract because there was incentives. It's very hard within our industry to give an incentive if you're not on pay-per-view. There's never been a ratings bonus, just for example. It's always done within our industry if we take our cues from boxing based on pay-per-view. So the UFC was able to offer some really good incentives. And you guys know all about Fight of the Night. You've heard about locker room bonuses and these different things like that. And that was only done exclusively through the UFC, which would seem generous. It would seem nice. So if they were the generous and they were the nice and they need review, of course everybody else would too. But when you would listen to the arguments, no, it wasn't about that. It was never about the contracts were done wrong. It was never about the start and stop dates were not correct, that a fair negotiation didn't take place, that I wasn't paid market value, that I wasn't paid on time. It was never about that. It was about you made too much. You made too much money. So I just don't think that's a reason to sue. That's true. I don't think that. So when Jon Fitch succeeded, they won. To a degree, I mean, everybody put their swords down. There was a settlement, but it's like $350 million. So, of course, the attorneys are going to get somewhere right around 40%. Right? You're gonna have about $200 million that just goes to these lawyers. Right? Good job. But then the three guys that were named in it, from Kung Lee to Nate Quarry to Jon Fitch, would then get a lion's share, at least in comparison, to the guys that qualify to be part of it as long as they did not opt out. I could not tell you what you needed to be brought in on that, but it was not just anyone that's ever fought in the UFC. It wasn't. There was a couple of specifics. You had a fight between this date and this date. I want to say there was even something about rounds. If you were scheduled for 3 rounds or 5 rounds, I might be adding that in. But the point is, whatever the criteria was, I fall into it. Which is to mean, if there is a settlement, or if there is a ruling that is adverse to the UFC and monies are collected, when that gets divvied up, I would be one of the guys to receive payment. So, John's stance, he called me all these terrible names. I couldn't figure out why he was calling me names. Like, he won. He had an opinion, I had an opinion. And he was saying that I was against them. I was against the boys. And therefore, the only ethical thing for me to do is to refuse the money. The money that I qualify for due to this settlement, like so many others, a number of which I haven't the foggiest idea. Nobody knows how this is getting cut up, and they should. Our media is not great, but that is such a dereliction, because I don't think anybody's even looking into it. I mean, just to share with you, like, from an interesting standpoint, they really have something there. You're going to have to ask a couple of questions. The reason I bring that up is, imagine that I was called as a witness, and I go and take the stand at the trial. Now, I'm under oath, and I'm going to be asked a question. Chael, do you feel the UFC treated you right? Now, I got to answer that. I have yes and no. I don't have a whole bunch of answers. I have yes and no. Now, my answer would be yes. But if it wasn't, if while on the stand and under oath I was asked that question, the UFC treat you right, and I said no, I'm then going to have a follow-up question, which is going to jam me up. They're going to say, where? Where were you not treated right? What was agreed on? What was your understanding that they then, as smart and intelligent people, took advantage of a lowly cage fighter? Tell us, please, Mr. Sonnen. I would have no answer. I would have no answer to that. So it didn't make me a bootlicker. That would be my answer under oath. This isn't a thing where you go and team up with the boys just because it's the boys. It's not a situation like that. It's an objective situation to look at and try to explain, but I've never felt that the other side of me, still to this day, there's a settlement. It's behind us. They won. They won. I understand these things, but I'm sharing with you, I still haven't heard an argument as to what was done wrong to you. Every time I hear the argument, I come to the same conclusion, which is you don't think anything was done wrong to you. You just think they got too much. And I cannot tell you what a wildly unhelpful attitude that would be just to go through life. So Jon says that I should not take the money. And it was a tough one for me for a number of reasons. I mean, Jon's a wrestler. I'm a wrestler. He went to Purdue. I went to the University of Oregon. We know each other. We traveled around. We got the wives together. I mean, I have a relationship with Jon Fitch, not to mention I'm a fan. So when he was calling me these terrible names, it caught me a little bit off guard, but I'm still looking at it going, Jon, my stance from the beginning is that you're not being objective, that you are not being sincere, that you are being spiteful. And Vince McMahon had to talk about this psychology one time, as it had to do with a piece featured on HBO, specifically about Andre the Giant, who later in his career had turned on Vince. And when I got done with college, just to personalize, I'm mad at the coaching staff. Now, I could not begin to tell you why, because there would be no answer. They did nothing but believe in me, help me, and support me. I was immature. That is why I was mad at the coaching staff. But when I saw this piece, I go, oh my gosh, that's me. I have that same psychology. And what Vince said as to why Andre the Giant, who Vince had made a star and made rich and made famous and made his life what it was, why Andre turned on Vince, Vince said, because Andre's career came to an end, but mine goes on. The fact that we were doing this together, and I am now done. But you got a plane ticket out to Minnesota for a sold-out crowd tomorrow afternoon. Brought a resentment. And it's very true. I can just tell you that I had gone through some of that at a point in my life. And when Jon comes out and says that there's an inappropriate practice and there should be a penalty and let's burn this place to the ground and let's take what is ours. And if you're not with us, you're against us. When this whole thing is happening, I never believed in the sincerity. I never believed that anybody thought that they were mistreated. Anybody thought that they were wrong, that anybody had an understanding, whether it was in writing, whether it was a text message, whether it was verbal over the phone. Are you aware, by the way? I mean, if we're just going to be real fair here and try to look at this, are you aware that if there is a verbal understanding with the UFC, which is not what their understanding was, are you aware that 100% of the time, the UFC will go with you? And yes, they get fleeced because of it. Yes, I could tell you plenty of acquaintances of mine that have fleeced the UFC, and the UFC writes the check anyway. I could tell you a number of stories, but if there's ever, I understood it like this, then that's what we're going to do. Big checks. I could just tell you these stories, but I bring that up because reputation does matter. And when I do ask you a very basic question, which is, does anybody here, please a show of hands, believe that there was a dishonesty, that there was a trick, that there was some kind of trap that we went in, that there was some fugazi wording and a team of lawyers versus little old me? Does anyone believe that? If you do, please raise your hand and let's hear what your story is. But it wasn't a case of that. You go a little bit further and say, okay, but none of you started in the UFC. The only one here that started in the UFC is BJ Penn, who's not complaining. Of everyone else that ever went into the octagon, you started somewhere else, and generally multiple other places. So, with your experiences, other contracts, and other places, did they have something more beneficial to you than the UFC's practices and their contracts? And nobody would raise their hand. So when you start to see them singled out, I just thought that was very inappropriate. But Jon Fitch had a different opinion. And he said that I was wronged. Me and so many others, but that I was wronged. And he took his time, and he diligently, to a degree, was able to prove his point that he would have made under oath in a court of law. Which is why it was very troubling for me that he thought I should not get the money. He has been arguing for 10 years that I should get the money. That I was wronged. That I was an aggrieved party. That he knew more than I did. That he had an understanding that I did not have. He's been arguing that for 10 years. So what would change? Why would he think I shouldn't get the money? Why would he think that? And I think that I at least understood his point, which is you tried to stop this and you didn't have anything with it happening. I think to a degree I might understand his point, but it was very vicious. He called me a douche. Do you guys follow me over here? George Masvidal recently. I have heat with so few guys. Guys like me. I would be what's known as a popular guy amongst the boys. They like me. But George Masvidal called me a crotch sniffer. And I couldn't respond at first. I didn't know what it was. It's not a vernacular. We don't hear that. So Jon Fitch in this rant calls me a douche. And it made me very uncomfortable. A douche is either a liquid substance that is used for feminine hygiene or it is the administration. Like, think of an IV. An IV is a form of administration, not necessarily what's coming through. I've never really known the difference. But he called me this. Well, why would I be a form of administration or a liquid substance for feminine personal hygiene? It was a very weird thing to say. And then the very argument that he made, that I disagreed with, but he succeeded, he won, turned out he had it right, that I, along with others, should be paid. And then he wanted to take it back. He reversed his opinion. So, if he reversed his opinion out about me and I shouldn't be paid, I was not aggrieved. I had no damages. Well, who else does he think that about? I mean, is there a category? How many other guys is like that? Because it's a very meaningful amount of money, and if we're just getting out division, we're getting out calculators, and we're breaking this down, I'm sure that the UFC would really like to know what that number is. And lessen the pot. Was this just selective? Because that's not the way it was presented. If it was selective, it would have been Jon Fitch versus Zuffa LLC, but it wasn't. It was a class action headed up by Jon Fitch. But he's now coming out and saying, well, it's not everybody. That was more of a broad stroke. For example, that douche, Chael Sonnen here. And it was a very odd situation. And I'm looking at Jon, like, as he's doing this, I'm looking at this, and I'm realizing only 14 people have seen it. And, you know, calling somebody a douche, even if that's a weird thing like a crotch sniffer, is that even a bad word? I don't think it's 4 letters. I mean, like, there's worse things that he could have done. I will fully admit there's worse things that he could have done. But maybe it stung a little bit just because I know him so long. I have never wanted him to be part of this lawsuit, ever. I didn't want this to be happening. But I never attacked him. I'm not attacking him now. I will tell you, I don't think that he's being objective, and I don't think that he is sincere. I do not believe that Jon Fitch objectively and sincerely believes that he was aggrieved, or that his career and or his finances from the career, which is this sport, would be different had he not engaged in a contractual agreement with the UFC. I don't think he believes those things. I think he saw a cash grab. I don't think any of them think they were treated bad. I think all of them just think that the UFC made too much. And I think it's a weird way to go through life. I wouldn't want to do that. It's a personal thing. I wouldn't want to do that. I hope that my son doesn't do that. But when I do listen to the arguments, and I'll just stay on Fitch. I'll stay on Fitch specifically. But when I do listen to the arguments, it always comes from a perspective of, look at what I did. Look at how much I brought in, and look at what I got for it. And there's not a rebuke to that that's kind. There's not. You can go from the A to Z. The UFC was purchased for $2 million and they sold for $4 billion. Right? That's the A to the Z, and everything happened in between. Can we agree? Okay. Would the price it was purchased for, the A, would that be any different with more Jon Fitch or with no Jon Fitch at all? Okay. The price it was sold for, right? The A and the Z. Would that be a different number if there was more Jon Fitch or if there was no Jon Fitch at all? And you start to get into some of these positions where it's tough. Where it's a tough conversation, or it's tough to say to somebody because it's mean. But it doesn't change the reality of it. And the business went in some very different directions. And it grew. There was 6 people in an office, and there were 6 events a year. That went to 12, that went to 24. We had 48 2 years ago, coming on the backside of a pandemic. That's incredible growth. And that took money. And that took investments, and that takes turnarounds. And there was so many things done by the UFC, right? Because you can't do selective prosecution. You don't want to do that. And that was always a part of this, and nobody ever discussed it. Not Dana, not anybody. Nobody ever brought that up. Everybody, including Zuffa, kind of conceded to the fact of, yeah, we made more money than What you thought? Right? Like everybody conceded to that fact. There's rumors out there, just by example, that fighters are paid 20%. 20% of the purse goes to fighter, but in boxing, it's 80%. Now, before I get into the inaccuracy of those numbers, let's just stay on those numbers real fast. Let's just accept them and keep them. If you wanted that 20% that you don't think is enough, if you want that 20% to be 40%, you don't have to double the fighter's pay. You can just bring in less as a company. And that will also move that 20 more towards the 40. And that would appease people, and that would be okay. There was no contracts out there that had bonuses on top of them. Under SEC rules, you could be put in prison for what you do with a company's money if you have investors. Dana White's generosity, and this is without exaggeration, Dana White's generosity of giving money to athletes that he did not owe got called of the night bonuses, got called locker room bonuses. You've heard about some of this stuff. Would put him in prison. It's illegal. His generosity is illegal. And the only reason he could do it is because he owned the company with his partners that said, yes, that's what we're going to do. Now, I bring that one detail to you only because there's never been another MMA promotion that paid more than was agreed on. You're going to have a hard time finding any business that's done that, but never in an MMA promotion. And I use it as an example that why was it just the UFC that was singled out? If we can agree that the UFC's contracts are so bad they need to be sued, but at the same time we can agree they're the most favorable contracts within the industry, it would seem as though we have a problem. It would seem as though there is a massive problem here with moving forward, but we are going to move forward, and the only reason is if we squeeze this rock, it can bleed, and if we squeeze the other rocks, they can't bleed, which just comes back to my argument, which was never you didn't make enough. It was these guys made too much. And Jon Fitch, for what he has argued for 10 years, that I was mistreated, amongst others, to the point that he took that into court and succeeded. But now he's changed his mind. I was not. I am not aggrieved. I do not deserve. I should not partake and I should not have. And I'm wondering, well, how many other guys should we check that box? And for how long have you known and for how long have you been of the mind that not all of us were treated that way? I cannot imagine a scenario, and while I tell you I don't know what the numbers are, I can't imagine a scenario where the three guys that came forward and were the catalysts of this don't leave with 10%. Now that would be 10% each, which would mean Jon Fitch is awaiting $30 million. So at the same time, I wouldn't know that, but I also couldn't come to any scenario where those three guys collectively don't get 10%. I mean, altogether, they're going to split it 3.3% with a third left over. Okay, great. He's waiting on a check for $10 million. And the entire deduction is look at what I did versus look at what I've got. I'm not going to be getting a check for $10 million. I'm not going to be getting a check for $30 million. Is there anybody amongst us who could reasonably believe that Jon Fitch has done more with or for, however you wanted to word it, the UFC, than me? If you put our two contributions together, would anybody believe that? But he is about to get a check for $10 million, and I am not. And that is absolutely what this argument was from the first place. And, I mean, it's more philosophical. It's just an interesting thing, but I think if Jon was to look at it, he would realize this is quite an interesting legal maneuver. I think if you were to turn and ask, if you got a magic wand to rewave time, you're say, Jon, I can take you out of the UFC so it never happened. You were never held up for those years. You never felt disrespected. You never felt tied or bogged down. You never felt underpaid. You never felt underused. I can take it all away by you just never were in the UFC. Fedor. I'll just make you like fame, have a great career, and people will know you, and you're a tough guy, and you're going to live the dream, and go into the gym. You can do all of these things, just don't do it with them. I can take that away, or I can leave this element here. Which would you rather? He would rather stay. He would rather have those memories. He would rather have built his brand. He would rather have taken on George St. Pierre for the title than not. And he's changed his mind. He's changed his mind that all those guys named, myself included, were not aggrieved and we do not deserve. I think that Jon Fitch owes me an apology. I think he does. And what I am to do with that money would be up to me. Perhaps I share Jon's opinion. Perhaps I do think that is blood money. And I do. So perhaps my plan is to return that to the rightful owner. That will make me feel good and sleep at night. I also happen to be rich. So I would have the option to be very frivolous with the money because I don't need it anyway. I mean, that's really going to disgust people, right? That's really going to upset somebody, but it would still be mine. And to see a guy take a moral high ground that he went out and he fought for people and he was on the right side of things, and him and Johnny Law went to work to look out for the little guy. According to him, for 10 years, I was that little guy. I was also honest, same as I am with you right now. I did not want to be on the stand, but if I was brought on the stand, I would have one of two answers, yes or no. Were you treated fairly, in your opinion, yes or no? My stance hasn't changed, but Jon Fitch's has. And I think for that he owes an explanation.